Hello everyone, I'm Rhiannon and I will be covering the second half of 2.5.2 Rights and Law. First, let's start off with transactions. There's a big issue with transactions because how are we going to apply notions of privacy to something that involves more than one person, since privacy is the control of information about yourself. There can be instances where if you're selling something to someone else and they don't want anyone to know about the transaction, you can be like, "Oh, I'm going to tell people about this transaction if you don't give me more money." That's just a really simple example, but you can see that there's a really critical issue here when protecting information on both sides of the transaction. If we're going to assign control to one of these parties, you're going to need a really good reason to give it to them. We're going to talk about two viewpoints on this subject later on in the presentation, the free market view and the consumer protection view, so please keep those in mind. On to ownership of personal data. Some privacy advocates propose giving people property rights over their personal information. So the concept of property rights really does work when it comes to things like intellectual property, such as, music on the internet or whatever. But there are problems when it comes to personal information. Ownership of personal information is one issue. The book brought up a strange example. Who owns the information about your birthday? You or your mother? So your mother was more involved in the process. Thought that was weird. Also, what information do you actually own? I mean, you can't own facts about yourself. Intellectual property, the rules of copyright say that you can't copyright facts in the first place. And what about profile information? Can you copyright your interests? Obviously, you can't have ownership over, oh, my eye color is blue, therefore I own it. But you can own things such as your personal photographs. So it's really kind of figuring out what pieces of information you own. Information has both personal and economic value. The book defines a property right in information that is appropriate when information has value to society and is difficult to discover or create or collect. However, a person should not have a property right to negative information about someone, especially when its concealment aids someone else in misrepresentation or manipulation. Some of these problems can be solved with a basic legal framework. A good framework is one that can define and enforce legal rights and responsibilities, and having this is really essential to a society where there's so much personal information going around. A basic legal framework has three main tasks. One is the enforcement of agreements and contracts. Having these contracts is really important when it comes to those transactions we talked about earlier. It can help protecting both sides of the transaction. Unfortunately, contracts don't really cover everything. So setting defaults for situations that contracts can't cover is also very important, especially when you get a contract from a business and they just so happen to leave out something important that you're not expecting. Having basic standards is important for everybody. And of course, we're going to need penalties for criminal offenses and breaches of the contracts, because what good is a law if there's no punishment? Regulation's another topic on law. Technical tools and policies for privacy protection aren't really that perfect. Some businesses will have really lenient policies, so having strong regulations can help protect privacy. Unfortunately, regulation is not perfect either. The Congress has passed hundreds of privacy laws, but the laws themselves are usually just, based around general goals that they're supposed to fulfill, and Congress leaves these details to the government agencies that will write thousands and thousands of pages of regulations, which will take over several years in some cases. and unfortunately, it's really difficult to write a good regulation for a really complex situation. And sometimes regulations will have unintended effects that have not been foreseen. Um, Regulations can also be very costly, both in direct cost to businesses, and consumers to that effect, and can come with hidden or unexpected costs. Because obviously, we can't foresee all the problems that might come with a new regulation, especially one that's very detailed. It might, stump growth of some process. I don't know, that's a really vague example. There are disadvantages to regulations, as we have seen, but um, businesses will often underestimate the costs of not protecting privacy. That's really kind of finding that solid middle ground, I suppose. Now we're going to talk about those contrasting viewpoints that I mentioned in the first slide. The views of many privacy advocates can differ, so therefore their interpretations of the problems that come with the breach of privacy and their approaches to solutions will also differ. So we're going to look at two different views. I doubt these are the only kinds of views, but these cover a lot of different problems that can come from both sides. The first one we'll talk about is the free market view. The advocates of the free market view think that there should be more freedom when it comes to regulations, and they also seem to think that businesses should pay like really heavy fines if information is leaked, but not necessarily spend all this money on strict regulations and having like a structure beforehand, because that can stifle innovation. So the first thing we're going to talk about is they don't think that people should just be giving away privacy of people's personal information left and right, but that organizations that collect the personal data should notify the owner of that information if the organization's not going to keep it confidential. The free market view also believes in the freedom of contract. People should be free to enter agreements to disclose personal information for some fee or service or some other benefit. This applies to businesses and organizations too, not just individuals. The free market view also believes in a free flow of information and doesn't think that the law should prevent the usage or disclosure of facts that one has independently found, unless it violates someone's rights directly. Seems like kind of a vague description. I mean, people can say, oh, this is violating my right to this or that. So, I don't know. It comes with some discretion. The free market view also prefers to avoid these restrictive legislations because they stifle innovation. I talked about that earlier. On to the next viewpoint, the consumer protection view. This is the more like protective view over consumers, less freedom. This is concerned with how easily consumer information is leaked, and this view is also not very trusting of businesses. They think that businesses have lenient policies and are careless with people's information, so they aim to protect consumers against the abuse of this information and from consumers' own lack of knowledge, judgment, or interest. They think that consumers can't realistically negotiate contract terms with the business, or at least that is true to an extent. They also think that business privacy policies could be vague or too difficult to understand, and that some businesses don't even follow their own policies. So how can we trust them to handle our information? The consumer protection view is all about that thinking that privacy is a right and not something that we can bargain and pay in the nose for later, like the other viewpoint. So these are both really good viewpoints, and it gives us a lot to consider on these points. It doesn't, of course, there's no like one way to go about protecting privacy, so that's why it's such a big issue. Anyways, that's all I've got. I'll see you around.